I'm Tyler, and this is the AntiSocial Network.
Don't look away. Let the fear wash over you.
Hey, T-Dog. What is up in his house?
Welcome to your number one source of internet oddities.
My life is a living hell.
There's just so much beauty in the world, you know?
Here we host conversations with interesting people across the internet.
The God you believe in is not only not good, that God made a world filled with liberals.
Curse of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your chains.
You haven't heard of them, but I have.
Perhaps I am cringe, but that makes me free.
Join us every Friday for discussions on culture, entertainment, politics, religion, and whatever happens to catch our fancy that week.
Hell is actually real, and Christianity was right all along. Sorry.
Oh.
The cities are decaying, destroyed by decades of leftist policies. Return to monkey.
You're probably thinking this is some pretty deep stuff, and you're right.
This episode of the AntiSocial Network is brought to you by North Arrow Coffee Company, a veteran-owned company that donates 15% of its proceeds to pro-life groups like Soundview Pregnancy Services and Compass Care Crisis Pregnancy Center in Buffalo, New York. Support the AntiSocial Network and use code AntiSocial10 at checkout to receive 10% off your next purchase of coffee and other coffee-related products. Thank you very much. This week we are joined once again by our annual visit by Ian Kirkpatrick, then author, robot, loin streamer, and any other large number of titles she gives herself off and on from time to time. She just released the third book in her Bodymore trilogy. I do not have it yet. I still have to order it, but I will. And I hope everyone who does listen to this goes and orders at least the first one. The first one's also on Audible. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. Also, one of my new monikers is Idiot because I know that I have terrible opinions from time to time. But also, that means if anybody comes in the comments and calls me an idiot, I'm like, I know. I understand that. But you know what? It's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I know you tend to spend you've been spending a lot of your time on Twitter in the last couple of months going off on
Not
AI,
a lot of time. Not a lot of time.
Well, I guess there's relatives to being terminally online, and you're not quite there. But there are people who spend a lot of their time going after specific subjects, and you've particularly been going after the AI stuff, and I want to talk about that. But before we get into that, I want to obviously talk about the third book and how this has come along and how you're feeling about the new launch.
Well, just like you, I don't have the third book yet. I just ordered some this morning, so I don't have it either.
Well, you know what happens in it, I think.
This is the beautiful cover, but it just means I couldn't show you the cover except for adding it here on the screen.
She doesn't know what happened in her own book. That's really sad.
I do. Hey, that book took so much longer than the other two to write, and I don't know why. It might just be struggling, but
it's harder to land a plane than it is to take one off, so.
It went through so many iterations, so many more iterations. I know that I skipped stuff in book 2, and then I went around and added them in as I did the revisions. Like I skipped chapters because I didn't know what needed to be in that chapter. And so my methodology is like I'm following the story through, and then what the characters do and what their needs are informs me of what needs to happen next. But then since I kind of know myself well enough, I know when I'm in a portion of the story where I'm like, something needs to be here, but I don't know what it is yet. So then I just skip over the chapter and go to where I think it's going to be after that. And I keep writing forward. And then as I keep going forward, then I discover, okay, that's what happens later. So this is where what the earlier scene needs to be. And then in a revision, when I'm rewriting the whole book, I add in those scenes.
So for anyone who hasn't seen our previous 2 podcasts on the first 2 books, how do you describe the Bodymore books to people who, as your elevator pitch?
Well, it's about Joey, who is a mechanic in Baltimore, and she goes to the infamous murder park, or Leakin Park, which is a real place in Baltimore, and it's known as the body dumping ground. She goes to pick up her friend and his car that has broken down after dark, and he's not there. When she gets the car back to the body shop, there is a body, unironically, in the back of the car, and her friend is missing. So the story is her trying to find out what happened to her missing friend. And she discovers a city of ghosts underneath Baltimore. And that kind of is the launch of the whole thing. All 3 books are a continuation of the same story, but they have their own arcs within them. So the first book is her trying to find her friend, and she finds him by the end. The second book is dealing with what happened to them in the first book. because there are consequences of all of her choices in the first book. And then the third book picks up where the second book left off. And so there's going to be major spoilers if I even just describing where book 3 starts off, which I'm fine with. If you're fine with it, I'm fine with being like, this is where book 3 starts, because they're all contingent on the previous book.
I haven't finished book 2 yet. I need to I need to get through that before I ruin the third book. I mean,
even just stating the plot, where the plot starts for the third book,
is a bit much. So
it references how the second book ends.
Yeah, and there's a reason I've been encouraging people on Twitter to buy book 1 necessarily, just because, you know, I figured that the plot would be interconnected enough that someone picking up book 3 might be confused. So, you know, it's better to just pick the first one up and then read all of them, or better yet, just buy all 3. But, you know, whatever works.
Yeah, the state of Joey's choices and stuff that happens in the first book comes back to bite Joey in the end. So even if you're like, oh, well, she got away with doing this thing, she doesn't really get away with any of her bad choices. So if you had things that she did in the first book, you know, like jumping out the window at the police station, that comes back to haunt her later.
I remember you saying last year that you thought that the Bodymore books were going to be maybe your personal masterpiece, or the thing you were most enthusiastic about writing. Is that how you're still feeling as now that you've gotten the third book done?
I feel like it is a very meaningful series for me, because I think Joey is like a real person, but she's like from a being hurt background. The whole book, if you look at the arcs of it, especially, you follow the arc of grief, you know, the stages of grief, all 5 books. So not all of the stages are not in one book, but Joey's whole story is dealing with grief, and she has to deal with loss in a bunch of different ways. But then as you get into book 3, you get more of a different set of characters. Have you run into Ralph and Casey yet in book 2?
No, I'm still working on book 1, so.
Okay, I wasn't sure. But you you meet a medium in the second book. And then he and basically somebody that's kind of like a familiar, his best friend, because the medium was human at one point. And he has a best friend. They were in a band together. This isn't a spoiler. The moment you meet Ralph, you know that he was in a band. Which it has the most indie band named ever. They are the Badass Idiot Train.
Oh my.
And that came out of the way that stuff develops is so interesting for me. So when I was writing their bar, I was like, okay, I want to use the bar as kind of a snare trap for ghosts, because they're just going to attract the ghosts in. However, so then I was like, well, how can I name this to be very direct? I'll name it Baits, because it's a bait to get the ghosts in. But then I had to come up with what bait stands for. And that turned into, what are the first words I can think of that sort of go together that I could use as a band? Badass Idiot Train. There we are. And then you get to know Casey, and you're like, you know what? He would definitely choose that as his band name, because Casey is the boss of everything that had to do with the band.
I've heard worse band names. And it's authentic too. That sounds like the kind of thing I could see as a sticker on a bathroom somewhere.
Yeah, right. For an underground indie band in Baltimore. Started by a 17-year-old.
Yeah, that would be the kind of thing that guy would start.
So you've got that, and you start getting more into them with book 3. They're tools. Well, Ralph is sort of a tool in the second book because Joey needs help with something. But then in the third book, we go back to the roots of Bodymore, which is somebody is missing. And so then Joey has to hunt down that. And then she starts seeing the investment of Casey as a best friend and brother, because Casey and Ralph have sort of developed a brothership relationship since they're both orphans and they both needed company. And so then you start getting to see these different ways these families work together and their reliance on different people. And Joey starts learning from the people around her about being vulnerable, about trusting. And so the whole story is about healing and the grief process and eventually getting to acceptance and being able to grow past the trauma that hurt you as a young person. Because yeah, book 1, you see that she is not doing very well in life.
I was gonna say, I was thinking of the naming scheme of the books. Bleed more, plead more, and then grieve more. So I guess that makes sense. If the third book is about coming to terms with some of that, then
yeah. And then
fresh wound symbolism in the first book, and then healing symbolism in the third book.
Yep. And then pleading also has to do with her trying to bargain for the things that she doesn't want to lose, which is also part of the grieving process. And that's part of the process that's in the second book. Is most of it is spent with her trying to first plead and then bargain and reject what is happening. Because at the beginning of, I think, book 2, she's like, this is not happening. These are not the conditions that we're in. Everything is fine. And things are obviously not fine. I don't want to spoil it for you if you don't want it to. I mean, I can get into it if you want me to spoil it, but that's why I try to be very.
I want to know.
She is just rejecting the circumstances that she's in, and in the third book, she's having to face this is the circumstance, and she actually sees the evidence of how life moves on. Even if you want to reject that, I don't want to live in the way that I'm living right now, and I want to pretend that it's 10 years ago when I'm a kid and things are happier and at least happier than they are now, that you can't actually make that happen. You have to come to terms with your circumstances in order to move forward.
Which is the only way that healing works, so.
Yep. And so then you got that. And what I learned when writing Bodymore 3 is that, so there's going to be a prequel to Bodymore, which is...
I was going to ask about that.
Yep. So that's focusing actually on the medium and his best friend and their origin story. And it shows how he became a medium since he was born a human. And this year has actually been really, really interesting because in January/February of this year, so last year, I met somebody who is very creatively in line with me. Like, we just click. When you meet somebody and you're just on the same page and then your creative works just work together.
Yeah.
So then she's been working on a series or had this idea in her head for a series since she was a kid or a teenager. I've obviously been working on Bodymore for a couple of years now. And so then in November, December area of last year, we were talking and I was helping her figure out what she wanted to do and how she wanted to go forward with her series. Well, in January and February of last year, we discovered that our series have a lot of overlay. And so then come February of last year, we determined that our series are actually going to come together. And so Bodymore is going to end. And Bodymore 0 is kind of a prequel to both Bodymore and her series, because her series is completely separate. But the second book in her series is going to have her team come into Baltimore, into my version of Baltimore. And then they're going to pick up Ralph and Casey. And then they're just going to join her story, because the lore of my story and the lore of her story work together. But what you get with our stories is Bodymore is obviously very personal and on an individual basis. But hers is much more big world. So you're going to actually have people who understand the crazy things that are happening in that supernatural layer of the world.
Has she published any of her books yet? Or is that just...
Nope, this is her first work.
Okay, that'll be interesting to see that play out. I'm just with your characters in her book. That's fascinating.
Yeah. So like Joey and Jag might be off to the side. We haven't determined yet. We have an idea of... her characters having their cars going to break down in front of the bar that Ralph and Casey are in, because they're actually drawn to Baltimore because of what is haunting Baltimore overall, because the city is cursed. There's something actually underneath Baltimore that's caused, the Leakin Park to be a body dumping ground. Like, there is a creature that is from her book living inside of Leakin Park that is feeding off of the grief in the city. And so, like, none of the people in Baltimore know that this is happening, because it's like when you're the priest, basically, of something, so you understand how to look at bigger picture things. But Joey and Ralph and all of them are just kind of living underneath the supernatural circumstance without realizing what it is.
That's fascinating. I've actually been thinking about Baltimore in terms of a story I've been wanting, been throwing around the ideas of. I found a writing. I wrote up a writing prompt for a story about I should contextualize this, that I've been spending a lot of time in Eastern Tennessee lately. In the last year or so, we're just hanging out in the Smokies and kind of just observing this very strange, isolated mountain culture where you have people who are, they live a day's walking distance from civilization at any point you go at. And so I had this idea for a story about a traveling priest whose job is just to walk from these houses one by one and just to talk to people who don't have any connections to the rest of the world, because if you're a pioneer farmer in 1850, Of course, you're not going to be living within days distance of anything at all. You're gonna be you're complete like basically a complete. You're the kind of person that doesn't want to be around civilization at all. But a lot of them still want to have that connection to their ideas, their religious ideals from when they grew up. And the Baltimore kind of fell into it because I was doing research on like, okay, where was like all the major like religious places where if you were like wanted to be trained in the U.S. and Baltimore came up because that was the first major Catholic settlement in the U.S. So I'm like,
Baltimore has a really interesting history. It's a really interesting location.
Yeah. I haven't been there, but it's one of those cities that it comes up a lot just because of all the history that's involved with it, and it's it just the fact that it came up in my research, and then you're doing a an urban fantasy thing on it is fascinating. But
yeah,
why yours would be considered urban fantasy, right?
I consider it more magical realism because it's realistic but with the undercurrent of mysticism underneath it, whereas urban fantasy is typically more like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where you've got the mystical living alongside in a society alongside the normal.
Right.
Like, it's very subtle differences between urban fantasy and magical realism, but if you get the readership for one or the other, they have way different expectations for the book. I also think that Bodymore leans into being paranormal mystery.
Okay.
Because obviously you've got the what happened to Wayland, where is Wayland? And so then you're chasing that down. And I think book 2 has a little less mystery. I mean, you still got what is going on and how are we going to deal with this? And there's like some thriller aspects of the second book. And then the third book returns to being supernatural mystery because somebody goes missing again. And then the detective is playing a fairly large role in all of the books.
So is Bodymore Zero in the tunnel for next year then, or what is it? What is that looking like at the moment?
And at the moment, I just finished the first revision of it, and I just actually started the second revision this morning, and I think that's going to be the final revision because I think that the pieces are laid out correctly, and so then I can switch to editing brain, which actually makes stuff sound good. But the current goal is Bodymore Zero for next year. And then we'll have to see when my writing partner's story is set to come up, because I'm not going to pressure her in anything, but I'm going to be helping her develop. And then like in my stories, starting in 2, you get little sprinkles of things that will connect with hers. And then in book 3, you get more sprinkles of things that'll connect in hers. And since her story and my story connect through Ralph and Casey, when you get to Bodymore Zero, and it's pretty much a prequel to her story as well, the 2 main villains that you end up confronting in Bodymore Zero are actually going to be more discussed in her series.
That's fascinating, and I appreciate that level of corporate synergy among independent writers. That's really awesome.
It's been so exciting, and this is not the only thing that we're working on together. So I wanted to go back to your asking, is this going to be like my alma mater? I think that this is a very meaningful story to me because it's such a story of grief and healing and even love, because you get to see different types of love and forgiveness and all of that. But then her and I have been working on a Western as well.
I was going to ask
this year.
I thought you had mentioned that at some point. I was going to ask about that. How's that coming along? So
we've got the series title is going to be The Legend of Bill Cassidy, because the main outlaw is Bill Cassidy. But the story is actually about his children, because at the beginning of the book, the kids are all living on their own. They're all adults. I say kids, but Tommy is like 27, 28, and the twins are like 22, 23. And they're all outlaws because their dad was an outlaw, and they're also running from the person who was their dad's business partner, basically. And their dad's business partner was a psychopath that killed their dad. This isn't a spoiler because this is all part of what kicks off the story. Is they're on the run because their dad's ex-partner, basically their uncle, wants to kill them because he got angry that dad was like, I want to retire and give my kids a better life. And so Bill Cassidy basically stopped being an outlaw and became a sheriff/deputy for a township so that he could raise his kids and give them a better life. And then Silas got mad and then murdered Bill and was going to kill all of his kids. But so that's like, though, it starts the story. And so the kids have just been growing up. The older brother's been taking care of the younger siblings for 10 years. And the story is really about family and the healing. So because they were betrayed by a family member. In the last 10 years, it's just been them. They were also almost killed when they were 13. Like within 6 months of their dad dying, Silas found them again and almost killed them all. It started with the younger sister because she'd be the easiest one to pick off.
There's a qualitative difference between a premise of a story and a spoiler, but yeah.
This is all like very just there. And who knows what it will change, because I'm only about 20,000 words into this, and half of that is the prologue. But so the kids have been on the run, and they've not been willing to let anybody in because the last person they trusted was their uncle, and that just destroyed their life. They haven't been home since then. They haven't seen their grandparents since then on their mom's side, because since it's set in 1889, their mom actually died giving birth to the twins because it was so dangerous, because the younger siblings are twins. And so then they only have their grandparents, and then their dad was an orphan as well. So they don't really have an extended family. They just had Silas, and they had the grandparents on mom's side, and then the township that their dad was building their life for them in. And so then the Cassidy kids had all been just traveling and doing the best they could to not let Silas catch up to them because they're afraid of him. They've been overpowered by him. And the story is them sort of slowly finding more meaning, and eventually, now that they're adults, they kind of realize, I'm not going to get into all of the little details of the things because they just get introduced to more people. The prologue is Tommy meeting this woman that has no reason to take care of him and then takes care of him. I don't think that counts as a spoiler because it's in the prologue. He's running from this bar fight, gets shot in the arm, sneaks onto this property of this really, really rich chick, and then sneaks into her basement. She hears him, goes down into the basement with a shotgun, sees him like dying. And so then she's like, oh, let me go and get stuff and take care of you. And so then she just nurses him back to health until he's good enough to leave. And he's not used to experiencing this kind of kindness. And so then she invites him back, that whenever he's in the area, he can just come back and she'll leave the window open for him to sneak into. And it's just so jarring to him that he keeps coming back, and over time he falls in love with her and she falls in love with him. And that's kind of what starts the plot line for that. And then the twins meet somebody while they're robbing a house during a wedding party. And so then you just kind of get forced people that are from outside of the family into this group that they can't get rid of. And it kind of starts opening their hearts. And so that story is about family and coming together again. And the legend of Bill Cassidy is actually these kids, not the crimes that he committed and what he was known for, as you find out as you go through.
So is this looking at like a late 2024, 2025 time frame for when this will see the light of day, or?
Yeah, probably, because the first book in that's going to be a trilogy and then a prequel for Bill Cassidy. But the 3 stories are going to be for the kids, and then, the prequel for Bill. And I've already started on the first book, and I want to get working on that more. I've already started working on it with Bodymore. So once I start getting to editing Bodymore 0, then I'll have more time for it.
Well, it sounds awesome. I mean, I adore people who do Western stuff right now. Like, I
am so excited to work on it.
It is like, I mean, there's a lot of people who have kind of come to the same conclusion that Western stuff needs to kind of make a comeback. And are you familiar with George Alexopoulos, the cartoonist?
Yeah.
He's doing a Western graphic novel with Razorfist right now. Like, I'm very excited for that. I'm happy to hear that so many people are trying to do this genre and kind of try to do original stuff like that.
If I was playing Red Dead Redemption.
Well, that has something to do with it.
That's what happened. See, I just play stuff and then I get inspired. So like more than 20 weeks ago, because I had 20 parts and I took a couple weeks off because I had to work. But like, I started playing Red Dead, and if I play something or I listen to something and I just get an idea, then I just follow it. So it was the first week of playing Red Dead Redemption. And then I'm like, okay, I'm getting vibes. I have no idea what the vibes are. And then like a day later, I'm like, okay, Billy and Ace. I have character names, Billy and Ace. I know nothing about them. And then just over the week, I started developing them, and it took a bit of time. It took a bit of weeks to get a better idea of what they look like. I knew what colors they had. I drew immediate images using their colors. And then over time, their images kind of became refined of what they look like. And the cast is so interesting. But we got a 6-member cast of main characters. And they're all so unique.
You gotta start using your video game playing strategically to inspire, to be more writing inspiration. Just like
I mean, we got we got 4 books already for this, which is how long it's going to take. And then I got ideas for playing Yakuza for 4 other books. So like I've already got 8 books from 2 video games.
Okay, maybe you need to be careful with this then.
And technically when I was playing Disco Elysium, I also got an idea. It would be like a novella, but it would be like called When in Doubt, and it would be set in a city called Doubt.
Have you ever heard of, are you aware of the video game Hatred?
No.
That was the school shooter game from like 2012. That was like it was one of those like ultra controversial games that was just trying to be edgelordy on purpose. I'm like,
was that different than Postal?
Yeah, it was a lot like Postal, but I'm like, I was playing Hatred the other day, and I just had an idea for a short story premise I wanted to run by you. I'm like, no. It's like, oh no, he's writing a manifesto.
I've already got that covered. I have a story. I think it's on my list over there, but I don't even need my wall list anymore because I have too many stories to write now. But I already have an idea for a school shooter story that is called Killer. It's called Killer Culture.
Oh no.
So, when is that going to come? I don't know, because I have obviously the 8 that I just said. Then I have Dead End Drive 2, and I have Boom Boom Boom, or Boom Shakalaka Boom, and I have Cain and Abel, and I have Creatures Lie Here, and I have a different sci-fi that's in its first draft, and so I don't know when I'm going to get to stuff, but I've already been there if you're worried. Tyler.
For someone who is complaining about having too many ideas, you are rather industrious in terms of how much you're getting out. I mean, you have, 5 books in the past 4 years, so...
Yes.
That is...
And 3 short story collections.
Goodness. I still need to get a copy of Stygian, but... who among us can say that and still have more ideas where those came from, so...
Too many ideas. I need to now be able to write faster. But I get to a point where I'm like, I just have to not, or else it's not going to do anything.
Well, I mean, you can only do so much. You got to prioritize. Yep. So I guess switching over to the other topic I wanted to touch on, I was hoping you could kind of explain the Shadiversary stuff, because I've been seeing you talk about a lot of it, but I haven't really gotten the full picture of what's happening with that. I mean, I've been following AI for the past year just through work, so I know a lot of what's happening on that front, and I've talked to people who work in that industry a little bit, and they've kind of talked me off the doomer ledge a little bit on what they're saying about the technology. So I'm curious what's been going on and why there's such a rallying cry at the moment.
Well, I don't believe in doomerism, but the doomer of the generative AI, but I do think that it's something worth talking about, because I think that there's also a value conversation to be had, especially with it in terms of respect, in terms of like respecting each other and respecting a craft and putting other things above GDP, because I think a lot of people get focused on how do we maximize profit. And that's one of the things that first started sinking like movies, because the movie industry got switched over to being controlled by the accountants. And then everyone's like, why do movies suck? Because the accountants are looking at what will make them more money, not what will actually create cultural icons or be entertaining or give a reward to the viewership. It's like, oh, well, we can just throw out this garbage because when we export it to other countries that can't make movies as well as we do, then we'll make all the money back by other countries just going to see our special effects.
Yeah, I mean, Marvel's did just get the lowest box office opening in the history of the Marvel Cinematic Universe this past weekend, so...
Yeah, so I'm not really on the doomy side for that reason, but I am seeing like a corrosion of respect or care between people, and it's just getting more and more vicious. And that's what I've seen, especially with the Shadiversary stuff recently. So I didn't know about Shad, period, until actually January of this year, because I first heard of him from his generative AI posts. And back then, I kind of just watched, I kind of just ignored when it came onto my feed, and then he kind of kept going at it. So then I responded to a couple of them. And as what happens, when you give reasonable stuff and nobody responds, and then you do a meme and they respond because they're like, oh, that's an inaccuracy. You're like, of course you're going to pick the one thing that you're like, oh, that's ridiculous. See, they're maligning me, instead of actually responding to anything that is meaningful. So I was like, okay, Shad, if you're going to keep talking about this generative AI stuff and you are such a proponent of this, let me go and see what your art actually looks like. Because one thing that I generally try to do is I do give people a chance. And so if you want to tell me that you are an artist, that you're a writer, or you do any other kind of art, then I'm going to go and check out what you do. And so then why are you a proponent of this when you're this thing? And that's why I ended up reading Shadow of the Conqueror, which it needed help, considering it sounds like he's friends with Brandon Sanderson. It's kind of questionable why it went the way that it did, but okay. I think the worst thing, I was also really frustrated in looking at Shadow of the Conqueror when I was looking for book reviews because nobody was really talking about the details of the story. And it's kind of amazing that people who talk about the story will ignore the court scene at the very end of the book where I'm sorry, I've been calling it Shadlin for a little bit now. But where Dalen justifies his rape of a bunch of women and says that they should be happy and they should be lucky. And you basically got the rape victims coming up to the stand saying how grateful they are to have been raped.
That's a take.
Yeah, and so like nobody really talks about this. I think there was one person that took to the stand that was like, oh, he should suffer because I was raped, but that it mostly highlighted women saying, I'm glad because I have a successful child and my life is better because I have a child. And so like that's a thing. But so there was that, and then I kind of just ignore it. And after I did my Shadow of the Conqueror video, because the book was separate from my opinions of Shad. I still think that he was thrown through a ringer because anybody is, when your politics are highlighted and then maligned by other people who disagree with you, and then they kind of slur you as every sort of extremist that there is because they disagree. And so like a couple weeks ago when he had that with somebody else in the sword fighting thing, I was like, this isn't really cool. And that sucks if you lost a relationship because somebody got dogpiled on for different politics, and so they publicly disavowed you. Like, that sucks. But my opinion of your art is separate from my opinion also on your individual things. We can disagree on individual things. But over the last couple of weeks specifically, Shad has been going after individual artists, including George, these last couple of days. If you saw that or didn't, like a week or two ago.
Alexopoulos?
Yes.
I don't follow Shad, so I haven't seen him get retweeted at all, so...
Well, I don't follow Shad either. I've muted him, so I don't have to see his stuff show up on my feed anymore because of the algorithm. But I saw Shad and Alex going back and forth, or George going back and forth, and Shad and Ethan Van Sciver going back and forth on this, because it was stuff like people saying everybody is an artist, anything can be art, and Ethan Van Sciver saying no, art is very specific, and George Alexanopoulos also saying this is very specific and being against generative AI, and then it turned into Shad saying everybody is just jealous and these people aren't actually artists because their art sucks, and who are people to tell him that he's not an artist when their art is worse than his. But being an artist doesn't have anything to do with your skill level or whether your work is realistic or not, because Dolly doesn't do realistic art. There are a lot of people that do really obscure, even sometimes squiggly art styles that are not realistic looking, but they're artists because it has to do with the intent and the craft. Anyway, so I've just been following this stuff and wanting to talk about generative AI and how AI is affecting things and what it's getting into. And I've done a couple of videos over time, just with different articles. I did one this morning for the different news that I'm finding, which includes voices being stolen for audiobook training, the images, the stealing of images, and how people look that Hollywood wants to do to basically make actors not needed anymore. And I think in general, what this comes down to for me, and what really bothered me with the generative AI discussion, is how many people were saying, well, I don't need your consent. I don't have to respect you. I can take what I want because I want to. And yeah, nobody can stop you. In the same way that if you, during, the Summer of Love, nobody could stop the smash and grabs. There were just too many. But just because you can get away with something doesn't mean that you should. And for me, this comes down to we need to respect one another. And when you say, well, I don't care what you want, I can take from you and you can't stop me, then it just shows a fundamental disrespect for fellow man, and you will do whatever you want to raise yourself up. And that's more damaging than it has to do with the arts, is that carries into all of your relationships with other people. And that becomes the culture where it's just a culture of theft, and it's a culture of hating people, and it's a culture of bitterness.
Well, even with the AI stuff, just specifically, the way it's played out has been frustrating and fascinating all at once. Like back in February, there was a woman that kept trying to sue for the right to copyright graphic novels she was generating entirely with AI. And like, obviously the courts took one look at it and it said, yeah, there's no way, this is an original artwork. So with copyright, it's like, no, you can't do that. But the fact, and I mean, I've used the Bing AI a couple of times, mostly to make memes. Which I don't think is like, okay, it's I don't think that crosses any moral line just because you're just crap posting at that point. But the fact that there are people that actually want to use this for something other than people that want to actually use this in a way that's abusive is awful. Like I know there are AIs that do offer some level of compensation for the people that are using it. Like the people who do ChatGPT are like will buy AP articles so they can train it, and then they'll pay AP to do that, and that seems like it's a fairly ethical way to handle that. But
however, you have to also consider with ChatGPT, there have been articles that have come out that include one of its data sets was like book set 3 that had 160,000 copyrighted books in it for living authors that were just taken from pirated websites and fed into the data set. So you might be like, well, in these cases, they're paying people. Yeah, but the majority of the data sets, they're not.
Yeah, and that's wrong, obviously. And those words are going to work their way back into the AI and then become part of the way it makes its logical decision-making. And one way or the other, they're going to be abused, so...
Yeah, and then you see in the conversation, well, it's already over. So then, like, what? You want compensation of 5 cents? How about you don't steal from people and then say, oh, well, it's too late to do anything, so you don't get it back?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not totally against AI, but I definitely don't like this culture we're in where people think that it's just it's capable of anything, and B, it should be capable of everything, and because it is capable of a lot, it should be doing everything it can do. I mean, this technology is very. It's dangerous in the sense that it's bad in the wrong hands, and it really needs to be used ethically by the people that have access to it.
There's also the, for some reason, blatantly trusting it, because generative AI doesn't understand nuance and it can't lie. If you think about when you're writing a book, if you want your characters to lie to one another, but not tell the reader that they're lying, then you just have them say something that is blatantly untrue. And then you have to, as you go along, kind of pick up the hints or the character finds out about it. But if you write that with a generative AI, it's just going to be straightforward, or it's going to contradict itself.
The AI doesn't even realize it's doing that for the most part, because it's just it's going off of what it was fed. So garbage in, garbage out.
And if you think about stuff that's they're talking about training them to be doctors, think about how much nuance is underneath diagnosis, because there's so many overlaying symptoms that you actually have to have the nuance to discern, okay, what have we tried? What is up with you? Because otherwise you're just going to continuously get misdiagnosed.
WebMD AI says you have cancer.
Everybody just has cancer. GPT, what do I have? Cancer. See yourself to the nearest suicide pod for curing.
Oh yeah, it's the Maid AI, and it's everything you put in it just says kill yourself.
Yep.
You've heard of that, right? The Maid, the Canadian people who are like, oh, I see you have post-traumatic stress disorder. Have you considered killing yourself?
I see you stubbed your toe. Consider killing yourself.
Yeah, it's horrifyingly unethical, and let's make the AI make the call.
Yeah.
All right. We're kind of hitting the dead end of the Zoom call, but I wanted to real quick. I wanted to touch base on the you have the second annual upcoming cringe stream. Do you want to tell people about that and how they can participate?
So guys, I run a loin stream, which is just a book reading club on my channel every Friday night or most Friday nights. And the last Friday night of the year is going to be a cringe stream where you write the cringiest fiction that you possibly can, short story. We're going to read them all together, cringe together, enjoy the cringe together. And then next year there will be a loinies vote. And that has to do with all of the loin stream reads that we did this last year to talk about which ones we liked the most and vote for things. And there will be a vote for the best cringe fiction. So join us, have a good time, let your cringe flag fly. And it's kind of just meant to be a good time to not overthink yourself, because a lot of people can kind of get caught up in, what if I get judged? What if I write poorly? Do it. We're all here for it.
I'm still very proud of the Cult of Paddington short stories.
That got first place last year, so you should be.
I didn't even put that much craft into it. I was just like, how much insane crap can I write down?
That's what it's about.
Oh yeah, there was cannibalism in it, but it doesn't count because it was a bear.
It's bearableism.
Yes. Where can people find you on Twitter and YouTube?
KirkPattieCake, everywhere that I am.
Short and sweet. Good to hear it. Everyone go out and buy a Bodymore and go show us some support. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Have a great rest of your day.
And don't die.
The AntiSocial Network is a Groupthink Productions and cultural review podcast. Editing, hosting, and producing are by Tyler Hummel, art by Crystal Cowley, and original music is composed by Guap Squad Gang and Melissa Lafira. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment below and tell us anyone you think would be a good guest for the show. Thank you for listening.